This week on Viewpoints.
We're living in an era of partisanship and a political partisanship that is more divisive than anything anybody in any living generation has seen before.
Why are young men and women so deeply divided? Then,
I haven't received a death threat in a few months, but I get ugly messages.
We speak to a librarian caught in the crossfire of book censorship. I'm Marty Peterson.
And I'm Gary Price. These stories in depth this week on your public affairs magazine, Viewpoints. In September, NBC News released a poll with surprising results. Gen Z has the biggest gender gap of any generation. But what does this really mean? In politics, social issues, and even measures of success, Gen Z men and women are further apart than any other age group. If you look back at the last presidential election, 61% of women ages 18 to 29 voted for Vice President Kamala Harris, while only 47% of Gen Z men did the same. For Corey C. Miller, a Gen Z researcher and professor of leadership studies at Wright State University, these numbers aren't surprising.
From an ideological perspective, Gen Z women skew much more to the left than Gen Z men. We found in our study that 46.8% of women, Gen Z women, lean left, whereas only 25.75% of Gen Z men lean left. Now you flip it around the other way, and you have 21.26% of Gen Z women lean right, whereas 37.86% of Gen Z men lean right. Everybody else is sort of situated in the middle. You look at Gen Z women, 28.36% in the middle, and you look at Gen Z men, and that is 29.35% in the middle. So they both have something relatively similar in the middle, but where they really differ are on those kinds of bookends.
And these ideological differences go past politics. In 4 studies that took place between 2014 and 2021, C. Miller found that Gen Z men and women often care about very different social issues.
How does it show up in terms of what they care about? Well, it's interesting because they do have some things that sort of cross over in some ways, and then other things that are not at all similar. We've found that some of the things that continue to hold very strongly for Gen Z men are things around the cost of higher education. That's come up a couple times. The environment has come up. Things around technology, limitations on personal freedom, not being able to kind of either express themselves. This could include things like being able to carry a weapon. It also includes things like being able to be free from having their bank accounts hacked, those kinds of things. And then they also care a lot about unemployment, economy, getting a job. So really the kinds of things that sort of cluster towards the top have to do with money, the cost of higher education, the infringement upon personal freedoms, and then things around employment and the economy.
Interestingly, women are more likely to prioritize human rights and social justice over economic issues.
Women, on the other hand, the things that continue to come up for them are really, really situated around the environment and we would call them like kind of, social justice issues, things like racism, sexism, immigration, human rights, equality. They do have a couple notes on things like financial security and cost of higher education. But again, I think that the cost of higher education is emerging for both of them because our populations we continue to study are college students, and college is expensive. So of course, they're going to be concerned about that. But they have less concerns that they've continued to express about things around money, economy, and jobs, and are much more around human rights and the environment, whereas the men are much more around the economy and jobs and costs of things and personal freedoms.
And the divide doesn't end there. The NBC poll found that Gen Z women are far more likely to feel anxious about the future. As for measures of life success, both groups prioritize financial stability and having a successful career, yet Gen Z men are more likely to see marriage and family as central to success. What makes this so striking is that it's a complete reversal from the past. Up until the 1980s, young women typically held more conservative views than young men.
In older generation, it was kind of the opposite, right? The men were more liberal on a lot of social issues, and women tend to be, or used to be, more conservative. That's why a lot of scholars are kind of surprised at why we see this, what we see with Gen Z. We would expect that they become more similar over time, right? Or both of them become more liberal, but somehow that's, at least in some countries, that's not the case.
That's Richard Nenstiel, a sociologist and postdoctoral researcher at the University of Bern in Switzerland. He says this isn't just an American trend, it's gaining ground in Europe and Australia too. One theory is that some young men are trying to hold on to power in a world where more young women have a lot of opportunities too.
There are different explanations put forward for this. One is that some men maybe perceive like fear of losing like their status in society. So that's one point put forward by some studies. Another one is that because of educational expansion that was quite massive in many European countries, and I also think in the US, young men nowadays, of course, do not only compete with other men that are on average more highly educated, but also with a lot of women that are nowadays very highly educated. And so there might be some sort of backlash towards gender equality because a lot of them might fear that they lose out, right? When they have to compete with a lot of well-educated women, but of course the relative position gets worse compared to other generations.
Another contributor, social media. Unlike earlier generations, Gen Z has spent most of their lives online. Platforms like Instagram, TikTok, and X make it easy to find like-minded people. The result? Online echo chambers, where the same opinions get louder and louder.
You might be in a group online and all of a sudden, you know, a women's group, and then you get a lot of people sharing very similar thoughts, and you get kind of a more salience or strength in those thoughts, which is really different because that creates much more of a kind of a partisan or even just a divide when you feel more emboldened, right? Like if I'm the only one who's like, I don't know if I want to have kids right away with my partner, and I'm sort of thinking about it, but I get online and I join a group and like, it's like all these women are like, I'm childless and that's what I want to be. All of a sudden, I'm much more emboldened in my choice. And so those differences just become much more stark.
Layer on rising political polarization and the reasons behind the divide become more clear.
I think that we're also living in an era of partisanship and a political partisanship that is more divisive than anything anybody in any living generation has seen before. And this idea of these polarizing differences just shows that people have very different ideas, and the relative unwillingness of people to come together and work together and the incivility that's happening around that is making it so that instead of the idea of like, let's work through our differences, let's capitalize on our differences, let's, collaborate through our differences. Now it's just, I don't like you, you don't like me, you're wrong, I'm right. And that mentality has really shifted over into saying like, there's groups of people who have thoughts about one thing, they may never come to accept that other people have different thoughts. And so that can be a factor that can affect not just Gen Z men and women and their thoughts, but any groups of people that might have differing thoughts. There isn't like the space to come together anymore.
This divisiveness has also led to less romance. Researchers note that Gen Z reports less dating and relationship experience compared to older generations at the same age. Semler believes Gen Z might move away from traditional ideas of partnership altogether, like getting married or having children.
I think what's going to be really interesting to track are marriage and childbirth rates for the next 10 years of this generation, to see to what extent they are keeping pace with other generations. Are they foregoing traditional marriage and actually doing cohabitation or other forms of partnership? Are they having more children, less children? What are their views? And it's kind of hard because, like I said, some of them are still only in high school, so they're not at a point where they'd be making those decisions. But I think following this generation for the next 10 years on those metrics alone can be very interesting.
While Gen Z may be deeply divided today, it doesn't mean that it's set in stone forever. Many in this group are still in high school and are young enough that their views are still forming and changing. For this reason, researchers caution it's too early to draw firm conclusions about an entire generation. To learn more about Corey Semler, Richard Nenstiel, and all our featured guests, visit viewpointsradio.org. This segment was written and produced by Grace Galante. Our executive producer is Amira Zuveri. Our studio manager is Jason Dickey. I'm Gary Price.
Coming up, what's the top banned book title? Clockwork Orange. We speak with a librarian about her experience during this time of increased book censorship in America when Viewpoints returns. When middle school librarian Amanda Jones opened her email on August 14, 2022, her hands started to shake and she felt short of breath. She had just received a message from a stranger that accused her of being a pedophile and a groomer. It concluded with a threat, quote, "You can't hide, we know where you work and live. Click, click, see you soon." what had Jones done to prompt such language? She had spoken against book banning at a local public library board meeting in Livingston Parish, Louisiana. On the agenda that night was a discussion around banning books with LGBTQ content and prohibiting signage for things like Black History Month and Pride Month. As a librarian herself, Jones was concerned and felt the need to speak up.
I talked about the detriments of book censorship, and I never named a single book. I just was speaking in generalities, and that's all I did. And close to 30 other people also spoke at that same meeting and said pretty much the same thing I did, some of them a lot more heated and with a lot more passion.
In her speech, Jones explained that libraries have diverse collections with resources from many points of view. She told the audience that there was a system in place for parents to challenge books they felt were inappropriate, but that a library's mission is to provide access to information for all users. Even though Jones lives in what she describes as a conservative Louisiana community, she was shocked and heartbroken by what happened next. She's since filed 3 police reports, a defamation lawsuit, and received many death threats. Many of her neighbors have turned on her. Some friends grew distant. She says even her parents couldn't understand her point of view.
And I've been in a lot of therapy since then to try to process, but I'm so used to the hate at this point. It hasn't stopped. It started in July of 2022 and it's still ongoing. It's constant. So I'm used to it now.
Jones writes about her experiences in her book, That Librarian, The Fight Against Book Banning in America. Before becoming a school librarian a decade ago, she taught English language arts to 7th and 8th graders. Jones has seen firsthand the positive impact books can have on students' lives.
I've had multiple students that are now adults who have contacted me to say, I remember I read this book in high school or in college, and I was at the brink. I thought about taking my own life, but I read this book and I stayed another day and I read another one and I read another one. And even though you didn't recommend that book to me, I developed my love of reading because you taught me in 7th grade and you taught me the importance of books and literature.
Jones says comments like these are especially true for people who identify as LGBTQ, those who have been ostracized by their own communities or their own families, and who turn to books for solace.
As a school librarian, I want to make sure I provide a safe place and a safe spot for every student in my school. The Human Rights Coalition in 2023 published a study that said, it was a very large amount of students feel unsafe at school, but 9 out of 10 said they feel the safest in the school library. And to me, that's very important. And it goes to not only the attitudes and the direction and the way a school librarian treats kids, but also the resources that are provided. But again, I'll reiterate, we don't provide resources that are not age relevant to our students. So I would not have books that are sexually explicit in my school library that is 9, 10, and 11-year-olds. A high school might be different, though. In Louisiana, you can get married at the age of 16, but you can't read about sex. It's a little hypocritical.
According to the American Library Association, in the first half of this year, there were more than 400 attempts to censor library materials and services, with more than 1,000 unique titles being challenged across dozens of states. As books about LGBTQ issues, sexual health, and race have been targeted for removal, libraries have been thrust into the spotlight. So far this year, Louisiana legislators have introduced multiple bills that could negatively impact librarians. One of them, HB 777, would have criminalized librarians for using public funds to attend American Library Association conferences.
What I'm seeing is apathy from people. People either are apathetic or they're not paying attention, or, the people not paying attention don't need the books or resources because they tend to have money. But it's going to affect the most vulnerable in our communities, the people who rely on the public library for internet and story times and resources. And if people don't start paying attention, we're going to see the destruction of our libraries and schools.
Even though some of these proposed laws have been killed, Jones says the ripple effect will last decades through soft censorship. According to the American Library Association, soft censorship is when books are purchased by libraries, but then placed in restricted areas, hidden, or kept off limits. Jones says that because of harassment, Librarians are scared to even order books that could be deemed even remotely controversial.
My friend Tom, who is the past president of the Missouri Association of School Librarians, he's in a lawsuit right now. He joined with the ACLU to sue Missouri because they'll criminalize librarians if books have sexual content. But what people are equating sexual content could be a handhold or a kiss, but because it's a member, two girls or two, they're saying that's inappropriate. And so people are scared to buy books like Lori Halse Anderson's Speak or Toni Morrison's The Bluest Eye because they don't want to be put in jail.
Since that initial board meeting 2 years ago, Jones says she has become more introverted. She has had security cameras installed and has started carrying a taser. She says she often gets her groceries delivered and chooses the pharmacy drive-through option to avoid negative interactions. Although she was born and raised in a politically conservative community, Jones explains it is important to her to protect access to books that discuss race or LGBTQ themes.
My parents are ultra-right, and my parents can't wrap their heads around some things I say and do. And I say, you raised me to be this way because you raised me Southern Baptist Republican. You raised me to believe that God is love. We should love thy neighbor as thyself. We should be good Samaritans. We should champion the underdog, and we should stick up for the First Amendment.
The story of Amanda Jones and other librarians caught in the middle of this censorship battle has been turned into a documentary called The Librarians. The new film, which was released on October 3rd, is currently screening in select theaters in the U.S. and abroad. To learn more about the documentary, head to thelibrariansfilm.com. You can find out more about Amanda Jones and all of our past guests at viewpointsradio.org. This segment originally aired in December of 2024 and was written by producer Polly Hansen. Our executive producer is Amira Zaveri. Our studio manager is Jason Dickey. I'm Marty Peterson.
Viewpoints returns in just a moment.
This is Viewpoints Explained. I'm Ebony McMorris. Jane Goodall has passed away at the age of 91. She's best known for devoting her life to the study and protection of chimpanzees and for forever changing the way we see animals. For Goodall, her journey into science was anything but typical. Back then in the 1950s in Europe, it was almost unheard of for a woman to study animals alone in the wild. Science was dominated by men, and the image of a young English woman living in the African forest leading her own research was groundbreaking. She didn't just challenge assumptions about chimpanzees, but questioned gender roles and the assumption that women couldn't be field scientists. Despite the critics, she got her foot in the door and booked a one-way ticket to Tanzania to study chimpanzees under the direction of paleontologist Louise Lackey. Once there, she observed these primates creating makeshift fishing poles to catch termites. This broke the long-held belief that tool making was unique to humans. Over time, she documented them hugging, playing, and even mourning the death of loved ones. The more she watched, the more it became clear the world between humans and chimpanzees was similar in many ways. Goodall was also well known for her observational approach and unique ability to connect with animals. She gave them names, detailed their personalities, and formed special bonds. This approach shifted how science and the public viewed not just chimpanzees, but wildlife in general. Today, she leaves behind more than just scientific papers and breakthrough discoveries. Her compassion, patience, and connection towards animals changed how we view the natural world and our place within it. That's Viewpoints Explained for this week. More in a moment.
Welcome to Culture Crash, where we examine what's new and old in entertainment. Leonardo DiCaprio is one of the biggest movie stars to ever live. He proved his dramatic chops immediately with his tender performance in 1993's What's Eating Gilbert Grape, before becoming one of the most charming romantic leads of the 90s with Romeo and Juliet, and of course, Titanic. He's teamed up with many of the greatest living directors for all-timer roles like Billy Costigan in Martin Scorsese's The Departed, and Frank Abagnale Jr. in Steven Spielberg's Catch Me If You Can. He held the center in Christopher Nolan's Inception, turned villain in Quentin Tarantino's Django Unchained, and gave a performance for the ages in Scorsese's The Wolf of Wall Street. He won an Oscar for pushing himself to the physical limit in Alejandro Iñárritu's The Revenant, and then in 2019, he turned in what is one of my favorite performances of all time as Rick Dalton in Tarantino's Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. Far from the young charmer of his early career, Dalton forced Leo into new territory. He played an aging actor, full of nervy energy and hectic desperation. In 2023's towering Killers of the Flower Moon, DiCaprio played Ernest Burkhart, a real-life figure as so dumb and confused you'd have to pity him if he weren't also such a malicious force of evil. And this year, DiCaprio stars in the new film from Paul Thomas Anderson called One Battle After Another as Pat Calhoun, aka Bob Ferguson. Calhoun is a revolutionary who turns into Ferguson when all that youthful exuberance leads to tragedy and he's forced into hiding. 16 years later, Ferguson is a burnout loser, trying his best to be a loving father. He's back to the nervy desperation of past roles like Dalton and Costigan, but this time DiCaprio is more aged and weathered than ever before. Gone is the young boy who made America swoon back in '97. In his place is a bona fide character actor, likely the best of his generation. This man once played Jay Gatsby, toasting champagne as fireworks exploded behind him. And now he's Bob Ferguson, a paranoid isolationist stuck in his pajamas as he scrambles to remember secret codes and pounds his chest in defeated frustration. Leo has run the gamut of roles for the past 30-odd years. His personal life has become the stuff of tabloid fodder and social media snark, but every time he shows up on screen, you can't help but be captivated. Always exploring, always relating, and often helping create masterpieces with master directors. I'm Evan Rook.
And that's Viewpoints for this week. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram to learn more about upcoming shows and find a library of past programs on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, and Spotify. Plus, you'll always find previous segments and more information about our guests at viewpointsradio.org. Join us again next week for another edition of Viewpoints.